Hey everyone, it's Harry, your host from Money Teacher. So, the House just approved over $1.2 trillion in government spending, and most people only saw the headline. But buried inside this vote were major funding decisions for healthcare, housing, transportation, and border enforcement. Plus, a controversial amendment that was meant to block funding for a rule some people fear could eventually allow the government to shut off your car. And that amendment failed. So, today, let's break down what actually passed, what almost changed, and what this means for you because some of the most important parts of this vote barely got attention. What passed on January 22, 2026, the House passed the final set of spending bills needed to keep the government funded through September 30th and avoid a shutdown at the end of the month. Instead of one giant bill, lawmakers voted on two separate packages. One passed with broad bipartisan support. The other passed narrowly and split Democrats. Together, they make up the last pieces of the federal budget for this year. The big number altogether, this package totals about $1.2 trillion in spending. Here's where the money went. Defense. The largest share went to the Pentagon. Defense spending about $839 billion. That includes a 3.8% military pay raise, funding for weapons systems, shipbuilding, and missile defense, increased money for training, readiness, and military operations. Supporters say this is necessary for national security and global stability. Critics argue defense spending continues to grow while domestic programs face tighter limits. But defense wasn't the most controversial part of this vote. Health and education. The House also funded health, education, and labor programs at about $195 billion. This money supports the National Institutes of Health, which actually received an increase, the Centers for Disease Control, avoiding deep cuts that were proposed earlier, mental health services, opioid treatment and prevention, child care assistance, education programs, including PEL grants. One key detail here, this package rejected major cuts that were previously proposed for public health agencies. That decision helped the bill pass, but it didn't stop the biggest fight of the day, transportation and housing. Transportation and housing programs were funded at about $13 billion. This covers air traffic control and FAA operations, highways, transit and rail, housing assistance programs, rental assistance, and housing for older adults. These programs keep infrastructure running and help stabilize housing costs. But again, they weren't the main source of political tension. That came next, Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security bill passed 220 to 207, one of the closest votes of the year. Most Democrats voted against it. The reason was Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. The bill kept ICE funding roughly flat instead of cutting it at a time when the agency has been under intense scrutiny after a fatal shooting of a U.S. citizen in Minneapolis. Democratic leaders said the bill lacked strong enough accountability, did not add enough restrictions on enforcement, failed to include tougher oversight. Even senior Democrats who helped negotiate the broader funding package voted no on this bill. Why the votes split? Here's where this vote gets more complicated. Republican leaders argued that keeping DHS funded was necessary to avoid chaos, especially with a shutdown deadline approaching. They said cutting or defunding ICE would disrupt border enforcement and basic DHS operations. Democratic leadership saw it very differently. They argued the bill did not include enough accountability after recent enforcement actions and missed a chance to impose stronger limits on ICE's authority and funding. What made this unusual is that some Democrats broke with their party and voted yes anyway. Those members said they were trying to prevent a government shutdown, keep funding stable for other DHS agencies, avoid disruptions to essential services. At the same time, even some Democrats who helped negotiate the overall spending deal still voted no on DHS to signal disagreement with how ICE funding was handled. So this wasn't a simple party line vote. It was a mix of policy disagreement, political pressure, and timing. What Department of Homeland Security included? Here's the part that often gets missed. The DHS bill was not a blank check. It included $20 million for body cameras for ICE agents, reductions in enforcement and detention funding compared to earlier drafts, new reporting requirements on how DHS spends its money, cuts to funding for the DHS Secretary's office. Republicans argued this was a compromise, funding the agency while adding oversight. Democrats said it still didn't go far enough. That's why DHS was voted on separately from the rest of the package, the SHUTOFF amendment. Now, let's talk about the amendment that caused the most confusion online. Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky introduced an amendment that would have blocked federal funding from being used to carry out a vehicle safety rule already in federal law. That rule comes from a 2021 infrastructure law and requires the government to develop standards for impaired driving prevention technology. Supporters of the amendment warned this technology could eventually act like a government kill switch for cars. Critics of that claim say the rule is meant to prevent drunk driving, not allow remote shutdowns by police. But concerns remain about false positives, who controls the technology, data privacy, how the rule could expand in the future, what the House did. The House voted on Massier's amendment. The effort to block funding failed. That means the House did not vote to create a new power to shut off cars. It voted not to stop funding for developing those safety standards. The rule itself still has to go through additional regulatory steps, but the funding remains in place. That's why the issue isn't going away. Other quiet moves. A few other things were folded into this package. The House repealed the law allowing certain senators to sue the government over January 6th phone record seizures, extended programs that were set to expire, including flood insurance, completed all 12 required spending bills for the year, avoiding a shutdown. None of these grab headlines, but all of them mattered. What happens next? Even though the House passed this package, it's not final yet. The Senate still has to approve it. If the Senate does not pass this funding package, or if it makes changes the House doesn't accept, the government could shut down again. That deadline is at the end of January, and without a deal in place, funding would lapse, and federal agencies would begin shutting down. That's why this vote happened now. Lawmakers are under pressure to keep the government open, avoid furloughs, and prevent disruptions to services. And this package is their path to doing that. So, while the House vote was a major step, the clock is still ticking. What this means, this vote wasn't just about spending. It showed which programs Congress chose to protect, where lawmakers are divided, how controversial ideas can survive quietly when amendments fail, and how much policy can be decided through funding, not headlines. The government stays open. Health and housing programs continue. Defense spending rises. ICE funding survives under pressure. And debates over technology, privacy, and government authority are far from settled. So, when you look at everything that passed and everything that almost changed, do you feel like this spending package actually reflects what everyday Americans need right now? Or does it feel like Washington is still arguing over priorities while the real financial pressure keeps building?